Today we are getting one step closer to the completion of our Imperial Agents combat patrol. We really only have the characters left, and today we're going to be painting up two of them in a relatively similar style to that of the box art for the two models in question. Conveniently, the first one that we're going to be painting is roughly the same colour scheme as a Cardinal from the Catholic Church, which conveniently fits in with our scheme perfectly. We are going to be kicking off the model with the cloak, and the cloak we want to paint as a black. So to paint up the black, what we're going to do is actually make up a mix. First, we want a dark greyish blue grey black tone. This is a very, very dark bluish grey shadow charcoal colour. And then to that, what we're going to want to add is a pale desaturated blue grey as well as a pure black, and we're going to mix all three of those together for our base coat colour. This mix can be taken and then applied over the entire coat of our Zenithal primed model. This will give us a really dark natural mix of our colours. We want to subtly bring up the brightness of our coat by mixing in a little bit of the light colour from our last mix, and to do this we can start to carefully apply small stippling dots across the entirety of the coat using thinned paint and a small brush. This first round will cover the entire area of the jacket, but what we want to do is make sure that we do catch all of the edges so that these are already picked out. Then we can add a very minor brightening effect and start to look to texture the coat a little bit more. And what we're going to do is build on the previous steps by yet adding more of our lighter colour into our mix and then reapplying the stippling, but this time focusing more on the edges and the raised sections of the coat. We are going to need to go through and do this a couple of times and add more and more of our highlight colour with every single pass. Essentially, we're going to be recreating the same effect as a normal layer highlight, reducing the area at which we stipple every single time, except in this case, it will take a lot longer and we need some patience and a fine tipped brush. Let me show you what I mean. As we go through and complete the next two passes, you can see that we are narrowing the areas of highlight with each pass. But there are the odd dots that do go a little bit beyond the bounds. And this is a thin spread out area, and then it gets denser as they move to the center. This helps to give a slow fade all the way from our final highlight, which will be a thinned pure highlight tone application, all the way down to our darker shadows, which was our base coat. Our highlight tone will be applied in essentially thin dots all the way up to the brightest point. Now, at this point, we've potentially gone a little bit too bright, but it's not a problem. The coat may be reading a little bit too much like grey as opposed to black like we want, but that is why we've had this black in the mix the entire time. What we're now going to do is take this black, thin it down into a really nice thin glaze consistency, and then use this to darken and reinforce the shadows on our cloak. We want to thin our black from the mix to a glaze consistency, and then with a small amount of this glaze in the brush, which should help to avoid mass pooling on the model, we can start to apply this very thin glaze, starting at the brightest point of the model and then pulling towards the darker sections. If we need to add some more darkness, we can simply go through and apply more glaze layers, similar to when we are highlighting on the narrower passes. We can just make the shadow area smaller each time. Providing we have thinned the paint enough, we should be able to give all of the areas at least one coat and then darken down the shadows from there, giving us a nice subtle textured highlight across the entire jacket. That effectively sorts out the robes for us, and the coat is all done and our blacks are sorted. But there is one very important thing we need to touch on first, which is why did we use three paints in that mix? We were painting a black cloak. Why did we need to add the dark bluish black grey tone? Why didn't we just use the light grey and the black and then mix up our colours between the two? And we could have done that, but the very important reason why we added our third colour is to try and build some consistency across the model. I want to try and harmonise multiple elements of the paint job on this model, and I think the easiest way of doing that is, where possible, adding in our dark bluish charcoaly grey black tone, and then mixing this in, where practical, to all of the colour schemes. What this will mean is that on all of the elements, there will be that subtle consistency in all of the shadows where this colour will show up more. Next, we are going to tackle the red sections on the model, and this mainly comes in the form of the collar, but we can also choose to pick out things like the weapons if you so desire. Our red base coat is going to be a mix of a dark and a bright red, with a portion of our harmony consistency colour being added in the form of the dark bluish grey. In our case, this gives us a really dark purpley red tone, And this is going to be perfect for base coating all of our red sections. Then, similar to when we were painting up the cloak, what we're going to do is start to slowly add our bright tone and come in with some highlights. Here we are opting to do a few passes, getting brighter and brighter, but unlike the black cloak, we are going to be applying these in a relatively smooth highlight layer as opposed to a textured stippling layer. It took around 3 layers before we built up to a nearly pure bright red for that final highlight pass. This should give us some really nice dark rich reds and also a pop of brightness, and I do really like how it came out. We're going to be painting the rest of the model in a second, but what I like about this is a model we can paint in a box art style similar to the priest and monk that we did before, but we have the advantage of it kind of fits with our theme. If you don't know, there is a rank, for lack of a better word, in the Catholic Church that I believe is called a cardinal. And cardinals tend to wear red and either black or white. Conveniently, the 2 colours on this model are red and black. So I think this fits in really well with our Catholic theme without needing to actually change the colour scheme from the box art. Obviously, if you wanted to adapt the colours, that's entirely fine. But I think this fits in really well. So now let's jump on to some of the other elements like the leathers and the metals. As I'm sure you're expecting, first off, we need a small amount of our consistent dark grey colour. Then what we can do is grab a warm reddish brown and a lighter ochre brown, and then mix these together to give us a nice deep grey brown tone, which we are then able to apply over all of the leather elements such as the belt, the holster, as well as the shoes. Once we've done that, we can add a little bit more of our highlight colour and then go around and apply a broad highlight across all of the main surfaces before we then apply one last round, and this will be the brightest we are going on these minor elements, mainly because they're smaller and less attractive on the model. The same goes for the skin. We will be jumping over to the skin and taking a light and dark skin tone and mixing in our dark grey. This will give us a slightly darker, cooler skin tone before we start to highlight the skin up over the course of 2 rounds. The first having a little bit more of the highlight colour and then catching most of the skin areas, leaving the base coat in the recesses, before we add yet more of the light skin tone and then go round and pick out all of the main prominent details on the face and the hands. Painting the skin like this also has one other advantage, and that is, not that we're doing it here, but if you wanted to add a sort of unshaven 5 o'clock shadow look, we can use this dark cool tone that we've mixed into our flesh tone. We can essentially thin this down, potentially mix in a tiny amount of each of the other flesh tones to give us a very shadowy colour that is reminiscent of the flesh tone that we've used, and then glaze this over the jawline, which will give us a rough semi-shaven look. And it won't look massively out of place because we've got this colour in the mix already, so it's present. It's not a new colour being layered on top of other colours that we've painted so far. We can next jump across to the metals, and here we have the weapons as well as the necklace and emblem. But we also have all of the trim along the edge of the coat. And for this, what we're going to want to do is grab a dark bronzy tone. The darker the better, as this will help to cover the area in one pass, reducing the need for us to try multiple attempts. Then, once this is applied, we can grab a slightly brighter gold and pretty much repeat the same steps as last time. Carefully working around the model, picking out only the trim areas and trying to avoid any of the elements that we've already painted. Now, this second layer is pretty much the base tone that we want for our gold areas. If there are any really tricky areas that you can't get and you've managed to cover with the very dark bronze, don't worry too much. It doesn't matter if we don't catch it with the lighter gold, but predominantly we want the base coat in this to give us a nice working standpoint, and if we miss any areas with the next colour, it's still a metal metallic, but we want the predominant area to be our lighter gold. Then what we're going to do is start to build up the highlights in the areas that we would expect. So any of the areas that are billowy and raised, we're going to be picking them out with brighter golds and going up through that highlight method. For this highlight method, we are jumping to a brighter, richer copper tone. And then this will be applied on all of the selections that we think will be hit with the most light, pulling from the shadowy areas up towards the raised sections, giving us more from our dark bronze layer up to a brighter, richer tone. Then we can repeat this entire step, but narrow the area and pick out the narrowest points using a silvery gold and hitting the most raised sections of trim, weapon and jewellery. This leaves one element, which is the book. And to be honest, for this one, we entirely cheated. We just slapped some brown contrast over the book to give us a nice brown leather looking book, and then applied a quick gold layer over the emblems on the cover. Now, to be honest, if I'd actually thought about it, I wouldn't have done the book in a brown contrast. I would have painted the book at the exact same time that I painted all of the brown leathers. However, the browns on my palette were already dry by the time that I got to this stage, and therefore I thought, we'll just cheat. It's my own stupidity. I would have probably preferred to paint it the same as the other leathers. So if you're doing the same, just paint it at the same time as the other leathers and learn from my mistake. But overall, I like how this guy came out. Here's some photos just quickly. We'll be doing some more photos and a kind of show off a little bit later, but this is how he looks so far. This means it's time to move to the second model in our box, and that is the hooded Imperial Agent. And to be honest, I really think I missed a trick. When painting the hood and the cloak and things for this model, I realised that, to be honest, the design and everything like that is very, very reminiscent of the main character of Assassin's Creed. So I really should have just painted it white. But it does beg a question. One, do you think this semi looks like an Assassin's Creed style jacket and model? And two, do you think we should spend the time to pick up another model and then possibly kitbash it into an Assassin's Creed replica? I think that would be quite a fun idea, but equally, let me know what you would think. We are going to use a similar theory for painting this model, and we can kick off with the red robes. And we're going to be mixing up a dark purple, a dark red, and a bright red. This mix will be used to apply a consistent base coat across all of the red areas. This will give us, naturally, a dark, deep ruby base to work from, and then we can start to build on that by adding more of the bright red from our mix, and then layering up a clean coat on the flat surfaces, leaving the base in the recesses. As with the reds on the first model, we can push the brightness up over a couple of passes until we are painting with a mix that is close to pure red. This last round can be rather narrow, essentially just picking out the sharpest raised edges. As you can probably tell, we're using the same theory for this model that we did for the last model. We're having a consistent colour across most of the areas. Last time, it was a dark bluish grey. This time, we're going for a dark rich purple. So we're going to add this into as many of the areas that are appropriate to get that consistent colour, so we can mix it into the reds as we have, as well as a few other areas. Obviously, a bit later on, we're going to be having a comparison slash side-by-side slash show-off of the models that we painted today. So what I suggest is keeping an eye out on the reds at that time, mainly because the reds are painted in exactly the same way, using the same two highlight and shadow colours. The only difference is on one of them we've used a purple as our consistent colour, and the other one we used our dark black grey. So let me know down in the comments below, can you see a difference, and if you can, which one do you prefer? With that tangent over, now the reds are done, we can move on to some browns. And here we're going to use a dark chocolate brown as well as a lighter rusty brown mixed in with our consistent colour. We can make a base coat mix up with these three colours and apply a consistent clear base coat across all of the brown areas. On this model, there are not very many elements that are brown, but we do have things like the shoes, the belts, and small elements like that. We are going to want to do a couple of highlight passes on this, the first being a relatively broad highlight, and then the second coming in with a narrow highlight, using a very bright mix of our browns and purple. Now, our next step is going to go in a little bit of another direction, and what we're going to do is keep the same methodology. We're going to have the continuous colour in the shadows, as well as our two other colours. But I want to try and keep this next section harmonious with the model itself, but tie it into the rest of the army, because this secondary model, the one with the cloak, doesn't have as much tying it into my army as the first model, bearing in mind I'm theming on the Catholic Church and things like that. So the easiest way to kind of tie it back in is to take the armour leg sections and the arm cuffs and things like that and paint it in the blue alternate colour that goes with my army. Predominantly red, yellow and blue is some of the Swiss Guard colours. So we've got predominantly red here. Let's give him some blue armour. And to do that, we're going to take our normal red mix, so our purple, red and red, and then we're going to start to chuck in some blue. And the primary focus here is to turn it to a dark purple and then progress up using the blue. This will give us a really nice purpley red base, similar to the colour of our cloak. Then what we want to do is carefully pick out all of the arm guards and leg armour From here, what we want to do is add a touch more of the purple and then use this to layer up any areas of shadow. This will give us a dark and light section comparison. Once we've done that, we can grab some layers of the brighter sections and start to highlight them up by adding more and more of the blue into our mix. After we've applied 2 or 3 brightening layers and narrowed with each pass, we come to an application of near pure blue, which can be applied on the most upward facing sections, as well as any of the sharp edges, giving us a nice move from a dark purple shadow up to a bright blue edge. Now, let's jump across to the face using our purple along with the shadowy and lighter flesh that we used in the earlier model. We are going to be building these up over 3 passes. The first can be naturally a base coat, which is going to cover all of the areas of skin. Then we are going to come in and we're going to follow it up with a relatively broad highlight, which will hit all of the raised sections of the faces and the hands. Then we can finish it off with a relatively fine edge highlight, this time using the brightest mix of our colour base coat with our lightest flesh, and catching all of the predominant features like the knuckles, the nose and the chin. To be honest, that kind of caps off the second model. There are a couple of elements naturally on here that you haven't seen us paint, predominantly things like the metals and the weapons. And the reason for that is we painted the metals in exactly the same way as we did with the first guy. There is absolutely no change, so I don't see the point of just replaying the exact same thing for you to watch it applied a second time on a different model. I'd rather save your time. But it is worth noticing that there are other smaller elements, things like the eye patch on the first guy. We sorted that with just a thinned down application of all of our blacks once the skin was painted. A couple of minor tweaks and things that you don't need to worry about. They are just the small things that you would do kind of by habit. And if we didn't cover it on one model, we've certainly covered it on the other. So with that all said, let's jump and see how everything turned out. Overall, both of these models came out really, really nice, in my opinion. Over the course of a couple of days, we painted up both of the models. And they're painted to look similar to the box art, which I think is quite nice. And they also fit in well with my army, especially the guy that looks specifically like a cardinal in my mind. Whereas, obviously, I mentioned earlier, the other guy, I think I missed a trick. I probably should have painted this guy as the Assassin's Creed character. I appreciate it for no reason would have matched the Catholic army. I don't think there is any correlation in the Assassin's Creed game to the assassins relating to the Catholic Church. If you're an Assassin's Creed buff, let me know down below because I may be wrong. But this would have been a really fun crossover. I think it would have been fun to potentially grab another model. So I might have to buy another kit of this guy and paint him up as Ezio or something like that from Assassin's Creed. And that, I think, would be really fun. I've done a couple of IP clash overs and mix-ups before, so if you want to check out one of them, why not check out this video where we smash together the Warhammer and another IP to make a fun model. Otherwise, do remember to subscribe so that we can see you next time.